Welcome everybody to tonight's session. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Anne-Maree Keenan OBE back to our research seminar series, and tonight she's going to be discussing a topic that I think is going to be of interest to a lot of people, and that's how to manage academic conflict without damaging your long-term career. So thank you very much, Anne-Maree, for your time this evening.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Carol. And this this is something that's actually quite close to my heart. It would have been incredibly useful if I'd kind of had this discussion early on. And so what I'd like to do is to, first of all, talk about why we're having this discussion. And then I want to talk about the difference between a positive research culture and kind of academic discourse, and really just make sure that everyone's aware that certain behaviours are absolutely not tolerated. Context and particularly some examples, and I want to start off with the examples, and then I want to talk about what is a positive research culture, what we're trying to achieve, and what's unacceptable, versus the fundamentals in handling people and handling situations. And then talk about some key skills in communications and come back to the examples, and hopefully for you guys to kind of have a contribution to how you might think of handling the situation. So one of the reasons why we're having this conversation is that it happens all the time. Research is often around academic discourse, not necessarily agreeing with other people, exploring different opportunities, exploring different boundaries. But what you need to make sure is that it's done in a way which is actually mutually respectful and ultimately driven towards an outcome that's agreeable. So the things that come up most for early career researchers are when you talk to different supervisors. So you're looking at developing a research question, and then you're being told to talk to this person and they'll have certain ideas, and then talk to that person, they'll have certain ideas. And it's how you manage kind of that conflict, that someone's telling you to do one thing and someone else is telling you to do something else, and someone else is telling you to do something completely different again. And so it's kind of, how do you negotiate all of that, given that almost by definition these people will be senior experienced researchers. The second example is the thorny issue of authorship, and this comes up time and time again. It comes up as an early career researcher, but it will come up, as a senior researcher. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the background of why authorship is such a thorny issue, and give you some examples or some kind of skills to look at how you can avoid having this kind of conflict, and absolutely is around understanding why authorship is important, what you need to really do to be able to negotiate that, and importantly to have conversations early. And then again, as examples for early career researchers, it's when you have a disagreement over the direction of research. And this may be fundamentally if you're developing an application, or while you're doing a project, be it a PhD. And one of the areas that can be quite stressful for early career researchers is when you've got a disagreement over the direction of research, particularly with one of your supervisors or with some of your supervisors. So hold those three examples in your mind as we go through what we're going to talk about in terms of an appropriate research and a positive research culture, and key skills in communication and managing people. So positive research culture is incredibly topical at the moment, and what it actually means is quite interesting, and a lot of this has been driven by the fact that research, because it is competitive, or it's often reduced to competitions, it's reduced to kind of metrics, it's reduced to kind of conflict creates an environment which is not necessarily the environment that research will flourish. And Wellcome have been very strong in leading on this and identifying that even though what we think about research and research environments, there's some good things, but there's some really difficult things that are apparent in the current research culture. And they commissioned this report that in 2018 around, let's have a look at what the problems are in research, and particularly for not just early career researchers, but for researchers in general. And listed a whole program of activities and came up in 2020 with this document about what researchers think about the culture that they're in, and it's actually quite damning reading. So I want to talk a little bit about this. I want to talk about appropriate behaviours, because one of the things is being a member of a research community is that you have to kind of agree to take on appropriate behaviours and that your conduct is appropriate to other people's conduct. We need to have an environment where there's robust discussion and discourse when you may disagree with someone, but there needs to be, it's done in an environment where it's respectful and absolutely there's zero tolerance on bullying, harassment. So if you have a look at the research culture document, their Wellcome document is actually really interesting reading, because quite clearly this Word document came around from out of surveys, that there are obviously some really good things about being part of a research environment, but there are also some really challenging things. And the good things are that most researchers are really excited and passionate about their research. They feel as though what they're doing is important, and importantly, it's valued and recognised. They also talk a lot about the issues around creativity and the importance of collaboration. And I must admit, that's just music to my ears, because there's so much evidence to say that with collaboration, particularly collaboration outside of your institution, your research is going to be much, much more impactful. And the NIHR have just commissioned quite an interesting report that's looking at, the research institutions, both universities and trusts across, and it's England because it's NIHR. And the difference and the impact when you research, when you actually are collaborating outside of your organisation, nationally, and more importantly, in terms of impact, internationally. So there's a lot of really positive things about working in research, but there are some really negative things, and so Wellcome have done a lot of work around this. Not so good, it's long hours, and bizarrely people just expect that. There's a real focus on metrics, on achieving grants, on achieving publications, on achieving citations, what your H index is, which I'll explain for those of you who don't know in a minute. There's a real, excuse me, issue. Excuse me, just have a sip. Excuse me, there's a real issue with funders that they don't want to take risks. They want to back winners. They want to back short-term projects. We know that the competition has increased, and there's a real issue, and I know this will ring true to a number of you, this whole issue around lack of job security. And this really does create quite a tense culture, even in respect to kind of a lot of the positive things that come out. But one of the things that the report identified, and this is important in terms of what we're talking about going forward, is around workplace dynamics and behaviour. And there's been traditionally, particularly around medicine and medical research, this issue around patronage and power, that people, it's kind of like a very paternalistic approach. If you join someone's research team, they'll look after you, they'll take care of you. Which is kind of quite old-fashioned. And there's also, very worryingly, is this issue around bullying and harassment. And in the very large piece of work that the Wellcome did, they found over half of those, and these are not just early career researchers, but the whole front runs full gamut. Over half of it have experienced bullying or harassment, and only a third would feel comfortable about speaking out. And I guess this really does indicate, and this is one of the things that I wanted to kind of highlight to you, we know that there's a real imbalance in power between particularly early career researchers and established researchers. But in saying that, there's still still an absolute zero tolerance in terms of inappropriate behaviour. And one of the quotes that really rang true with me is that when we're talking about this positive research culture and being supportive, etc., part of the problem is that what was appropriate before in terms of giving people direction and constructive management is now considered to be inappropriate behaviour and bullying. And as a research institute, it's one of the things that we have to try and encourage for our researchers, that, you know, again, the bullying and harassment, there is absolutely zero tolerance for bad behaviour. And there's a lot of work going on in that area. But I think it's kind of one of the things we find is perhaps with some of our more senior colleagues, this is a very great change from the environment that they knew. So what a positive research culture does is it promotes equality, diversity and inclusivity and fairness. And part of that should be around stimulating collaboration, innovation and engagement. So not kind of keeping people just in a particular small area, but looking at kind of the important where research makes an impact, and really crucially valuing respect of individuals and respect of differences between individuals and respect of different methodological approaches and different kind of methodological and intellectual inquiries, so that there's not one size fits all. There are a number of different ways to promote this. And there's been a huge investment in terms of research institutes, both universities and trusts, around making sure that this positive research culture is something that it's something that's lived and breathed, and that hopefully for those of you who are part of who are either students, postgraduate research students or staff, you will be aware of a lot of these things. And there's really importantly this issue on a policy on dignity and mutual respect, and it's really important that people know about that and know what their expected behaviours are. And if I can just do a short ad, so for those of you who are at the University of Leeds who are either postgraduate students or researchers, the Cedars survey is being conducted, and this is trying to capture exactly that. So it tries to capture the good and the bad in terms of culture, employment and development in academic research. And it's a nationally based research, but it also has local initiatives so that we are able to look at what's happening at Leeds to say, look, this is working and this isn't. So I would strongly encourage you, if you haven't completed that survey, to complete it. That being said, that we know that research, can be a combative environment, and that there will be differences of opinions. What I want to talk about is still going back to the basics, the fundamentals in handling people, and these are the things that should be your guiding light. So, crucially, where there may be a disagreement, it's really important to understand the other's perspective. And it's if you come from a particular area and you've got certain things that are absolutely key to you and that you think are important, the other person may have very similar kind of passions and kind of thoughts, but coming from a different perspective. So when there is some kind of disagreement, it's really important to understand the other's perspective. And you do that by asking. You do that by trying to understand what it is that that they think is important. It's around knowing who the people are that you need to speak to. So this is particularly if there's some kind of conflict around, it may be around, perhaps developing a research question. Someone will want to do it a particular way, Who are the people that you need to speak to? Who are the people who've been there, done that? Who are the people who've received funding? Who are the people who know the methodological areas or the clinical areas that you need to develop? You absolutely need to be multidimensional. You absolutely need to be able to understand that even though that you may have a way or a solution that is important to you, and you see this often from particular professional theoretical frameworks, that that this is kind of the way. I had a very bizarre conversation today with a scientist who absolutely believes that in terms of long COVID, physical rehabilitation is not appropriate, and that they need to actually get onto the inflammation, and that's their context, that's their understanding. But you need to be multidimensional, and you need to make sure that you're considering again the other person's perspective. And to me, this is a critical skill that people don't talk about. It's about fundamentals and handling people, and particularly managing more senior people. And these may be your supervisors, they may be your senior research colleagues, but it's around managing upwards. And it's really important that you understand that, particularly I think for senior people, that your activity is only a minor part of the umbrella of activities that they do. So interactions with you need to be focused and need to be organised and need to kind of be clear. And you need to drive them. You can't expect someone who's Professor, Sir, Lord, blah, 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 or just even good old, Joanne from oncology, that their time is incredibly important, and that if it's your meeting, or you're trying to develop a question, or it's your PhD, then you should be the one driving it, you should be the one organising it, you should be the one making sure that the things that you need to achieve are actually prepared for and will be developed in that particular interaction. And the other thing is to be a problem solver, and I think, and we see this time and time again when there's conflict, and it's usually not necessarily academic conflict, but it may be a more administrative conflict, where people might seem to be blocking what you're doing. And you might think they're doing it because they don't believe in research, or because they, don't want to support you, but it may be something much more fundamental. And we see this a lot with middle management and NHS, it can be an issue around that part of the problem is they want to support you, but they need to have some money or funding tagged to this. It needs to be part of a business case. So you need to find out what their drivers are and see whether or not you can actually solve those problems. And don't forget the fundamentals in communication. It's respect, it's openness, it's honesty, it's empathy. And these will set you up, for being able to manage difficult conversations. I can't emphasise the importance of these, and the importance of listening. And again, goes back to, you may think you know why someone wants to do something, or wants to block you from doing something, or someone wants to stop you from doing something, but it may not necessarily be what you think it is, and it may be that it's something completely different, and something that's actually really easily addressed. So the importance of listening is absolutely critical, as is a timely conversation. So if something has happened, and this is particularly in terms of conflict, if you sit on it and stew and then talk about it, 2 months later, it's going to lose its impact, and it's going to appear petty, or it's going to appear overblown. And I'll talk about emotions in a moment, but it's really important that if you have had some conflict, or if there's a potential for conflict, that you don't let it fester, and that you don't create all of these scenarios in your head about, drivers and what, people are trying to do. And instead, make sure that you kind of tackle that conversation as soon as possible. And the issue around a clarity and purpose of language is really, really important. So if you're talking about, I got really upset because, you know, you gave this presentation to this person to do instead of me. If you just say I'm really upset because I don't feel valued, that's really not helpful. So you need to have a clarity and purpose of language. And you need to kind of be clear about what it is that you want to get out of as a conversation and why you want to get out of it. And that's worth spending a bit of time doing. And then it's obviously around emotional control. Don't have conversations when you're angry or when you're sad or when you're tired. You need to kind of, because you're saying and do things that you don't mean, and you'll react to things that are being said in a way that is not necessarily intended. So it's absolutely around trying to understand, if you are angry, why are you angry, and trying to frame it in the way that, you know, why you're angry, or if you're upset, why you're upset. But you do have to park your emotions if you're going to be able to have some kind of fruitful discourse. So they're the kind of the key things. So if we go back to this example of finding supervisors, so one of the things that we find is that when people are trying to develop a particular PhD, or it may be a research project, that they'll go and talk to a whole lot of people. And what often happens is that you'll talk to someone and they'll say, oh, you know who you should talk to? This person and this person. So you end up having this huge network. And some of those conversations will go off in different directions, directions that you have no intention of going down. And it's particularly, I think, an issue when you're meeting supervisors who may have a methodology or an approach that someone has suggested might be useful for your area, but they don't necessarily understand, or it doesn't necessarily apply. And so I guess it's around, how do you deal with, you know, you've just had a meeting with Professor blah, 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 and, you know, you realise that that's really not kind of going to suit your ideas. And I guess the thing for me is, when it goes back to, don't forget the fundamentals. And it's around, you have a conversation, you've met with this person, you've taken their time. If that it's an area that really doesn't sit well with you or your project or the rest of the supervision team, that's fine. But again, let them know, and let them know in a timely manner. Thank you so much for meeting with me. I really appreciate the time that you've taken. What your approach is, while it's very exciting, I'm not sure it's going to work with this particular group, and make sure that you're saying that. And the other area is around that clarity and purpose when you're first engaging them. You don't go and say, I'm looking for a supervisor, will you be it? Can I come and meet you? But you're saying, I'm looking at developing a PhD in this particular area. I understand that, you know, your research is in this, and I was wondering if we could meet to discuss any synergies or any particular working together. So it's around setting it up so that the expectation is that this person doesn't think that they're a shoo-in to be a supervisor. And that's one of the things that in the supervisor session that we talk about. It's like, I think sometimes people don't realise how valuable you are as a PhD candidate, because it's one of the things that as academics we're measured on, our number of PhD students and our success rate. And particularly if you're bringing funding, that's incredibly important. So it's around having that discussion that I'd really like to discuss this with you. But then if it doesn't work out, that it's timely. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. Unfortunately, it looks like, you know, that this isn't going to necessarily work with this area. Thank you so much. And again, it's around, you know, some of the just deconstructing what can be complicated and making a lot more simple. If we go to the authorship, and one of the funniest things I think is when I was employed, those of you that know my story know that I came to Leeds and took up a research assistant job, which was hilarious. And one of the very first things, because I was a bit unusual as a research assistant, is that I had to negotiate between two very senior profs authorship over a paper. The paper had already been published, and one of the senior people had thought that they were completely wronged because they should have been included on this publication because it used some of their patients, and it was a very ugly situation. Now, the reason why authorship is important is it's not just about a recognition for the work that's been done and for a profile of being attached to research, but it's also for academics, incredibly important. And if you're not part of an academic situation, you may not know. So, and it's again one of the things that Wellcome identifies as problematic, that often we're reduced to metrics. And so there's things called like H indices. And H indices are basically an indication of how many publications you've had, what the journal impact citation factor is for the journal it's published in, and how many times it's been cited. And you can look at it without self-citation, because some people like to cite themselves a lot, versus no self-citation. And this kind of thing is really important. It's important in terms of progression, promotion, and it has been really important in terms of establishing esteem. So when we put in things like the Biomedical Research Centre application years ago, that we had to talk about people's H indices. Now, my H index is 26, and I'm really proud of that. And it's I used to be able to say it was the highest H index for a podiatrist in the UK. And now I can't even say it's the highest H index for a podiatrist in our household. My husband has gazumped me. But 26 is nothing. So if you're looking at someone like Paul Emery's H index is 152. And again, it goes back to how H indices are actually worked out. We know that they're a function of age. The older you get, your H index always goes up, it never goes down. They're gendered, they are so gendered, and that's because of a lot of this unconscious bias in terms of authorships and women. They're just terrible. But there's still a driver for a lot of things, and while we're trying to change that and change the emphasis away from it, it still is still a driver in people's mind. So that's why authorships are important. Ridiculously important. And so when it comes to kind of negotiating authorships, you've got a couple of things. So first and foremost, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors have come up with guidelines about who should be authors and who shouldn't be. So the classic thing was, when I first arrived in the UK, if you recruited patients to a study, you were an author. And it's very clear that that is not appropriate, and that's not part of the guidelines now. And so if you get into an issue where you're not concerned whether someone should be an author or not, it's very, very clear. And it's around the academic responsibility, taking academic responsibility for this research. And I think it's a good way of saying that, if this research was to be questioned, and to, would you be able to stand up in a court of law and say that this is this research is your research and is appropriate? So these guidelines are really, really useful. So it's a really good idea to get them. Again, don't forget the fundamentals and time of conversation. So one of the things you should be doing is having those discussions about publications, particularly if you're talking about you're starting your PhD, you will get publications. You have to get publications. That's one of the things that you're valued or you're reviewed against. But who's going to be on the publications and in what order? In medicine, last author is a senior researcher, so that's incredibly important. The first author is incredibly important. And it's around having those discussions early before the work is happening. And around it's that clarity and purpose of language. So trying to get that done as early as possible. And when you're starting a new project, it's often a discussion that you need to have. And finally, the disagreement over direction of research. It's one of those really interesting things, and often it could be a disagreement between supervisors, it could be a disagreement between you and your supervisor. And I think it's one of those issues for early career researchers where it can become quite difficult. And this is where I think you need to make sure that you check in with your emotional control. Your PhD often is your life, and that you often, when you're living and breathing it, it can become a little bit out of perspective. And so it's important that when you're discussing this, that you're not tired, you're not emotional, you're not angry, particularly when there's been some kind of disagreement. It's absolutely understanding the other person's perspective. Just because if they're saying no, do not do this part of the study, even though you're going to, understand why they're saying that. Is it a time issue? Are they concerned that you're not going to be able to finish your PhD? Is it because they disagree with it? Is it because, you know, that they don't necessarily understand some of the important things that you know about it? So making sure you have those discussions. Again, clarity and purpose of language. You know, when you're disagreeing, what are you disagreeing about and what are you agreeing about? And I think this is really important. And again, timely conversations. If things come up, particularly in supervision meetings, and they're not resolved, they'll often hang over until the next, and they'll become bigger and bigger. So make sure you have those timely conversations. And if you can't, there's always the process to go through. So there's always mediation. So you will, as a PhD student, have a tutor, and that's what their role is, to kind of be there to have offer that support. If you're not necessarily part of the supervision team, you'll have other team members or other researchers that could come in and try and act as a facilitator or you know, a mediator, someone who can help guide conversations, and someone, and you know, that person usually is someone who has no vested interest but wants to kind of resolve the problem, and it's not on one person's side. So I guess just in summary, managing academic conflict is kind of part and parcel of the job, but there are a couple of things that are really, really important. So remember the basics of communication and respect. Remember that for a positive research culture to work, everyone has to be committed, and that is the supervisors have to be committed to a positive culture, and also students and have to be committed and have to take responsibility for their behaviour. Absolutely, prevention is the best strategy. So if you can try and see where conflict is coming, that is absolutely what you should be doing. Timely conversations are really important. And where necessarily, there are absolutely formal processes where needed, and that's around either conflict or if it's around harassment and bullying. So that's kind of all I was going to talk about in a nutshell. So I'm absolutely happy to open it up to questions, comments, conflicts. Absolutely over to you.
Thank you so much, Anne-Maree. So I'm on my third device today, so I'm not quite sure what's happening with my Teams, but Teams is definitely not loving me. So thank you very much for that. So I am unable to see the chat at the moment. So if possible, if you could just have a look at the chat. But apologies also if I might have missed something. But can I ask a question to start off?
Yes. Absolutely.
So as an early career researcher, it can be quite intimidating with the whole process, you know, starting a PhD, changing, you know, your normal role, potentially from a clinical role into an academic role, you know, so everything's changing, and conflict potentially is one of those things that you're worried about to start with, and you know, potentially some of your supervisors could be extremely senior. Is this something that people should actually like have a conversation at in one of the beginning of their supervisors meetings, you know, just to lay down some ground rules about what we're going to do, how we're going to talk to each other? Because it's nice that, you know, that we talk respectfully to other people, but sometimes you don't get that reciprocated. So is that a conversation that we should start before we start our PhD in earnest?
Yeah, so I think it absolutely is, and I think that the university absolutely acknowledges the unfair relationship between you know, a PhD student and a senior researcher, and that that there are mechanisms to support people if they are having difficulty. But one of the things that I routinely suggest, and I'm more than happy to kind of share this with you, is to have, when you're starting up your supervision relationship, is to have it's kind of like a hello magazine. And honest to God, some of the guys I work with, some of the people I work with hate it, but to me it's really, really important because it starts a conversation. So with the supervisors and the student, and so it's things like I expect the supervisor to organise meetings, and then you have a rating scale, and I expect the student to the PGR to organise meetings, and so you both fill it out. And the reality is there's no right or wrong answer, but it gives you that chance to have that discussion. And it's like, and to me, it's got to be, you know, the expectation that this is your PhD, that you need to own it. And it's the same, so it covers a whole lot of things. And some of those issues are around things that you get trapped into. Why haven't you done this? You said you're going to do this, blah, blah, blah. And if it's quite clear and you have that discussion at the beginning, I think it's worthwhile. But you can have that discussion, you know, any way through, and you know. But I think it's knowing those expectations, and I think where you get into problems are when you have this confluence of expectations that, you know, someone's expecting you to do something and you have no idea that that's what you're expected. So one of the things I think is really important that you have those conversations, particularly if you're in a more vulnerable position, particularly as a PhD student. And happy to share that with anyone. I can either give the document to Carol, or if you want to contact me, I'm happy to share that.
That would be amazing. I now have this vision of this Hello magazine, and I have a vision of some of the conversations in the chats that I might put into it. I can't see the chat, I'm afraid, but I can see a hand. So I'm going to say, Peter, there's a question, and I apologise if I've jumped over somebody else that's put a question in the chat because I can only see the hands.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yes, I would, sorry, I've just lost you there, Anne-Maree, sorry. I would agree with everything you've said, and I think that it's absolutely sound advice, and that it's something that everyone should follow as a first port of call. What we do know is that approximately a third of PhD students experience bullying. So this is all the idealized world, and there is a hard reality, which is that for a minority of PhD students, they're going to encounter some level of malevolence. Now, no amount of kind of positive approach and clarity and honesty is necessarily going to help in that situation where you're dealing with someone who's being dishonest or manipulative towards you. So what would you kind of recommend in those situations? Because they are situations that unfortunately a minority of PhD students are going to experience. What do you think is the best course of action there?
Yeah, and Peter, you're right. It's also not a minority. We know the Wellcome survey was saying that 50%, half of PhD students had experienced bullying and harassment, and only a third of those were happy to speak out about it. So I think we talk about a positive culture. Our positive culture has to give people permission to call people on bad behaviour. And I think, well, there's zero tolerance. The university will say, and these are, I can't think of any university that doesn't say that there's zero tolerance on bullying and harassment. The issue becomes perception of what's bullying and what's harassment, and this is really, really difficult. And as I was saying before, that I think that there are behaviours that were acceptable in the not too distant past, which are absolutely not acceptable now. So I think, and I had this great discourse the other day around, it's kind of like we're putting the focus on the student, and I won't be too Australian, but that's just rubbish. That is absolutely taking the responsibility. It's kind of putting it onto the person who's most vulnerable. And I think as a university, and certainly there's been a huge push within the University of Leeds, and I know a lot of you may not be at the part of the University of Leeds, but I know this is happening across the board because it's a really important sector issue, that we need to make sure that the positive culture is around our supervisors and our academic community not accepting this behaviour and giving people permission to call people out on it. I think part of the issue has been around it becomes quite confrontational, and that if you go down a process, and having been in a previous job, I was actually chair of the disciplines committee, the way that it would only ever work if someone was leaving, and that's appalling. And I think what we now need to do is to have a culture where we can call people and have that discussion and say, look, I know that you didn't think you were bullying them, but this is this is not acceptable to say. I can't believe you've got to this stage in your career and and you're still writing like a health professional, which is something that my supervisor told me. One of my supervisors told me, not my most favourite supervisor, but it was just like considered to be absolutely appropriate. And we need to call the supervisors on this, and that's where I think there's a move towards trying to do this mediation that's not around some kind of a process, that is just more around upskilling kind of perhaps an older in a kind of older workforce, not as in senior, I mean bad culture research. She's trying to stick herself out of holes.
Thank you, Anne-Maree. That was a deliberately difficult question, and I think you dealt with it very well. Thanks.
Anne.
Before we just come to Arne, can I just ask you one quick question, Anne-Maree, just as a follow-on from Peter? Does the university offer mediation courses that students or supervisors can take up as part of that supervision PhD experience?
So the university has invested a lot within, in terms of the Vitae Concordat, and has a whole suite of activities around kind of this positive research culture. Now, it's a work in progress, I'm not going to lie, but there are courses that the organisational learning run, and I'm just wondering if Anne is going to be part from organisational learning and talk about this, but there are some courses that organisational learning run around dealing with conflict, around that whole team science, being valued as a member of the team. It's still a work in progress, but there are sources out there, and if you're not sure about it, just talk to someone, to kind of do a sense check. Is this appropriate? Is this not? I think that's kind of really important. And what kind of things can I do to make sure that that this behaviour isn't appropriate?
Thank you. So Arne is one of my colleagues, and so she's still at work by the looks of it. So Arne, over to you.
I am indeed. Yeah. No, my name is Amy. Yeah. This was actually prompted by your example with the sort of setting expectations tool, and you were referring to Hello Magazine, and I was like, I have no idea what this is or what she's referring to. And I think that's actually, that's sort of a more general thing with cultural references, but also intercultural communication. And I think the fact that a lot of our students are international, come from international backgrounds, and sometimes come from, non-European backgrounds, with not just very different cultural, a sort of set of references, but also very different ways of communicating. And, one, are we good enough in that? And what are the ways we can improve? What are the resources we have available to improve that intercultural communication?
So I think it's absolutely things like calling me out. I don't know what my magazine is. That's absolutely appropriate. Me being Australian, I thought it was being very worldly because I've seen it as in Melbourne. But no, you're absolutely right. And just saying, I'm sorry, I don't understand that reference is absolutely appropriate. I think in terms of the wider context, I think language, is really important, and I think that that it's it's often kind of it's around kind of just making sure that we're being more inclusive in terms of language, and again calling people out when things aren't appropriate. Just saying, what do you mean by that? I just don't understand. As an Australian, I spend half my time going, what? Yorkshire people talking about?
I guess what I'm thinking about is also not just, as I said, cultural references or specific words, but it's communication styles. So I've worked with students, for example, from certain Asian cultures, just as an example, and not to sort of be very general, not to generalize too much, but where the appropriateness and sort of like how do you communicate agreement or disagreement can be very different. And yeah, how do we get better to have those conversations, not just to rely on our own sort of cultural background in interpreting clues, I guess.
I think this is where you need to lay down ground rules, and particularly if you have got differences in, a cultural difference, and I think that must be incredibly difficult if you're coming and studying in a culture that has a completely different way of arguing in an academic environment. That must be incredibly difficult. But I think it's there in that case. I think that has to be a two-way street, where and it's a great learning opportunity to kind of talk about what is appropriate in terms of language, what's appropriate in terms of contact, in terms of, because it may be that people would not contradict someone who had a title, whereas it's around giving people permission. And I think this is what the research culture is. And it was when I was talking about having this environment which respects diversity in kind of individuals in methodological inquiry, in kind of discourse, but also in how we disagree. And I think that's the really difficult thing. And I think it has to be a kind of a two-way street where there's ground rules set, and it's not. That is absolutely not easy.
Thank you very much. Again, so I still can't see the chat, so I have no idea whether there's any other questions in the chat.
The chat's all just I can hear.
Or can't hear, as my case was. So can I just ask you one more question then, Anne-Maree, if that's okay, if nobody else has got a question? So people that know me know that I'm very emotional, and I'm not very emotional in the angry world. I'm very emotional in the crying world. And you say that you shouldn't have these conversations or have those big discussions when you're emotionally involved. I'm always emotionally involved, and I think it kind of links into something else we were talking about in a few sessions ago about imposter syndrome and all this kind of stuff. And if you do show your emotions, then you're seen to be weak. So how do I stop crying if I want to confront somebody or have that conversation? Any top tips about composing oneself, and how long is okay to leave these conversations? You walk out of a supervisor's meeting, at 8 o'clock this evening. Does it need to be resolved by a week's time, 2 weeks' time? Before it all starts to become, the elephant in the room, really.
Yeah. So for those of you that don't know, I supervised Carol's PhD. And yeah.
And she was a lovely supervisor. We never had any issues. These are all hypothetical questions.
No, I think you can't not be emotional, and I didn't mean to say that, but I think you can't be emotionally raw where you're reacting, not listening. And I think the really important thing to do that is to have some time separation, and even if it's just overnight, or 24, 48 hours, just to kind of say, well, why am I so emotional about this? Why am I upset? Why, and and it usually isn't necessarily just that issue. It might be a whole lot of other issues. And then when you can do that, then you can separate it from, okay, let's just talk about this issue, and so we can resolve this. And usually with a PhD, you're tired, you're overworked, you're trying to balance so many other different things, and it's just really, really difficult. So I think it's around trying to take the rawness out of it, trying to make sure that it is around one particular issue, or if it's around another issue, that is identified. And it's around, I think the other thing to do is to have that conversation, practice having that conversation with someone else, so you can hear yourself saying, because what I've often found is that when I'm really upset about things, when I actually articulate it, it's like, oh, is that what I'm worried about? Or, oh, okay, that sounds really petty. Or, oh God, I didn't realise that. So I think practicing having that conversation with someone, even if it's with the cat, I think is a really important thing to do, so you can actually verbalise And so that's what I would suggest. And I think in terms of the timeliness, I think it has to be when you're ready, but when also it's not going to be, redundant. And, we've all had meetings where I don't know whether we all have, but I've certainly had meetings where I've been in tears, because it's something, that's really important. And I'm not saying don't be emotional, but don't be emotionally raw so that you're reacting rather than listening and trying to understand what's going on.
Thank you very much. I don't have any other questions, which is quite strange for me. So I'm not quite sure if there's anything else in the chat at the moment.
Not in the chat, but is it Malenka?
Can I ask a quick question more around sort of authorship and around standing your ground when you're transitioning to senior authorship and kind of standing up for yourself, whether you've got any advice in that regard?
Sorry, how do you mean transitioning to senior authorship?
So, I mean, during your PhD, most of your authorships are going to be first authorship, isn't it? But then you kind of start taking on supervising maybe some MSc students, and they publish the work, and you kind of get to that point where you should be, you've done all the supervision, and you think that actually senior authorship would, be along the sort of next steps. But your senior also feel that actually, that your supervisors feel that they should still be senior authors.
Yeah, that's around the transition for independence. One of the really tricky things, I think, is when you have an ongoing relationship with the people who are your PhD supervisors, and it's absolutely appropriate to do that in some situations, but it's really important that they then also see and support your personal development from PhD student to junior postdoc to senior postdoc to hopefully chair or whatever. Really good supervisors will have a plan and support you for that transition, but usually it's when you're in a senior position, and so it's either when you are supervising or you've brought in the funding. But really, really good people will say, I'm a crusty old prof. I don't necessarily need another senior authorship. It would be good for you to have that authorship as a senior authorship, because this is much more important in terms of your career. Now, in a great world, that is what would happen. I'm not suggesting that all people are as advanced as that, but I think it's a discussion that you have to have. And it's a wider discussion around that independence, that transitioning to independence that's really important as you move from junior postdoc to postdoc. And if you're working with a good team, you should be able to have this conversation. And even if it's not this paper, well, or this grant, it's the next grant. So I think that again, it's having that conversation is incredibly important. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions?
Is there any kind of like I was going to say, is there any kind of like arbitration? Well, sometimes things can't be resolved.
If things can't be resolved, yes, we have a formal process for going through that. And what the work at the moment is on having it less formal rather than a process, but rather having kind of that discussion. And I'd love to say that it always works. It doesn't. And and sometimes it can't be, and so then it does have to go to formal mediation. But it is around being, and I guess if you're a part of a team where they're not allowing you to develop and grow, you'd have to ask yourself, is this really where I should be? And I think that's the kind of conversation. If they're not allowing you and supporting you to do that, there's no kind of process for that, then, it is that, is this really where I need to be?
Thank you very much. That hasn't happened to me. I just want to make that clear that, yeah, but thank you very much. I can't see the chat and I can't see hands now. My Teams is completely failing me at this precise moment of time. So I'm not sure if there's anything else out there.
No, nothing in the chat. I think people are getting ready for the kickoff, and yeah, and Carol will want me to say, don't forget to fill in the feedback form.
Perfect. Thank you, Anne-Maree. Not that I've bribed you or anything with that, but yeah, please fill in the feedback form. That would really help us. So if there are no more questions, then I am going to end the session tonight. Thank you so much, Anne-Maree, for such an insightful presentation.